Good afternoon and welcome to Speak for Climate, Speak Up for Climate. Thank you to everybody here who braved the threats of the winds and rains to be able to listen to this very exciting discussion on climate change. And good afternoon also to those who are following the discussion via live streaming at interaction.com/speakupforclimate and on Twitter at World Bank Asia and at Interaction. My name is Ana Oposa and I wear many hats. I am the co-founder of Save Philippine Seas, the Youth Implementation Specialist of the Asian Development Bank, and the Greeneration Ambassador of the Climate Change Commission. But for this afternoon, I will be serving as the moderator of Speak Up for Climate. This event is part of the World Bank's Development Discussion Series. Now, the Philippines is always named as one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. And while this poses several challenges, it also provides several opportunities. And it's been said many times that the youth are the future and the hope of tomorrow, but I beg to disagree. We too are the leaders of today. We're very grateful that the World Bank and Interaction, the online news portal of TV5, have organized an event like this, where young people like you and me have the opportunity to discuss pressing issues with world leaders. And to be more inclusive, we're also live streaming this discussion to make sure that other people who couldn't be here today can still be part of the event. That said, we are also known as the social media capital of the world, and today let's make the most out of that by harnessing the power of social media by tweeting our thoughts and questions for today's discussion using the hashtag #SpeakUpForClimate with the 4 as the number 4. And without further ado, I would like to introduce the president of the World Bank Group, Dr. Jim Kim. He was born in Seoul, South Korea, and studied in Harvard in the United States. And he is a doctor of medicine and anthropology. As the director of the World Health Organization's HIV and AIDS department, Dr. Kim led the 3x5 initiative, the first ever global goal for the AIDS treatment in developing countries in 2005. Now, his resume is much longer and will probably take another discussion. So I'll introduce now Dr. Jim Kim.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much.
Afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thank everybody for being here. We're very excited about this event.
Dr. Kim, you just came from Tacloban.
Yes.
And recently we're also at the tsunami hit area in Japan.
Yes.
Right? And what can the Philippines learn from other countries in terms of building resilience to disasters? Maybe you can talk about how your experience was like in Tacloban.
Sure. You know, it was, we all felt so badly for the people of Leyte. And I actually called President Aquino about 10 days after the event and expressed our condolences, and also we were able to move money very, very quickly to help. You know, we spent a lot of time in Palo, in Tanawan, and also in Tacloban City talking to people who had really been impacted. And you know, it's now coming on 7 or 8 months, but you could see that the pain from the experience was still very raw,
there, yeah.
very much there with the people. And I kept asking, so what do you want now? What are you calling for? And you know, their aspirations were just that we want to get back to the life we had before. And President Aquino has committed to building back better, which is really important. I think there is an opportunity, and we actually saw it in progress. We saw the building of homes, and rather than just using bricks, they were using iron rebar to make it more sturdy. So I think this is the opportunity. You know, unfortunately, in developing countries, there's the investments that we've made in resilience have just been nowhere near enough. And so we think that the commitment that the Philippines government has made, that all the partners, groups like us, the commitments that we've made to really investing so that the next time the poorest don't bear the brunt of the disaster again is one of the things that's really important. You know, in Sendai, when I went to visit, the size of the surge was just stunning. I mean, we were on top of a hill that was about 40 feet high, and the water had come up that high. And so one of the things that's very impressive to me about the Japanese government and the Japanese people is that they have committed themselves to making sure that all the poor countries in the world will have access to the kinds of technologies that existed in Japan. You know, in Sendai, none of the buildings fell. It was extraordinary. I mean,
Wow.
they had built on such a sturdy foundation that while some of the smaller areas right near the coast were destroyed, the tall buildings, which was what I meant, the tall buildings all stood. And so one of the things that we have to do now is to commit ourselves to capturing all the lessons from all over the world in terms of how to build buildings, how to prepare countries and especially poor communities for resilience. We need to spread those lessons to all the poor countries that are facing these kinds of crises. And at the World Bank Group, that's what we've committed to doing. We've completely reorganized ourselves so that we can be one of the groups that commits itself to capturing every single innovation, every single solution to the problem of adaptation and mitigation of climate change and bring it to all of the countries in the world. The Philippines is a leader. We're very happy to see that the Philippines has been so far out front. And you know, representatives from the Philippine government, one of the secretaries, really changed the whole discourse in Poland during COP19.
Yes.
The way that he expressed the pain and the reality of these extreme weather events in the Philippines really changed the conversation, and we hope that the Philippines will continue to change the conversation.
It's very inspiring for someone like you to say something like that about how the Philippines is very proactive, because I think a lot of young people, or a lot of people in general in the Philippines, have been very cynical about government and how the country's being run. So to hear it from you, it's very inspiring, and I think maybe we are making a little bit of progress.
Well, you know, it's the job of young people to criticize older people like me. You know, this is what you do. This is how you learn, and it's important for keeping us old people honest. But let me just tell you a little bit something about the government you have here. The commitment to fighting corruption is really unprecedented. The commitment to openness, you know, getting all the data out in the open, is also really unprecedented. And we were just at a session with the government leaders, and I have to say, you know, there's no government that's perfect. But this government, in terms of being a leading voice to fight climate change, you know, we've been very grateful for their support. We've tried to get out as well at the World Bank Group. There's a lot of things. We're involved in so many areas that affect climate change that we felt like we have to really get out front and lead. But I have to say, you know, the commitment to openness, the commitment to fighting corruption, the commitment to investing more in health and education, this is a government that we think the rest of the world can learn a lot from. Now, it is, as I said, it is your job to continue criticizing, and I know that you will, but it's important, I think, for some of us who fly around the world and meet with all kinds of different governments, important for us to give you some perspective that, boy, there's a tremendous amount of admiration around the world for what President Aquino and his government's trying to do.
Thank you. And with that said, we're in the presence of the youngest senator, Senator Bam Aquino. We are learning a lot from you. And we'd like to ask you, how do our laws address resilience, adaptation, and mitigation, given that, you know, storms are getting more frequent and getting stronger?
We have a mic right there.
So shall I stand up? Or?
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Dr. Kim. Well, I think in terms of the government, there's a general understanding that this is the new normal.
Yeah.
That was quite a popular phrase after Yolanda hit us, or Haiyan, no? After Haiyan hit us. And that's permeated to all parts of the processes. No? Everything from local government planning to legislative planning to creating better infrastructure down the road. This has actually been integrated in a lot of the work of government now. And in fact, there was probably one forum where the World Bank executives here in the Philippines actually said that we're one of the leaders in terms of integrating climate change into our local development plans. Right. I think Dr. Kim will agree with me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Not just national government planning, but local government planning. And I think that's a very important thing to differentiate. No? The national government will integrate or has integrated a lot of these climate change issues already in our national plans. But more than that, local government planning has also tried to integrate that, whether it's creating zones for evacuation centers or putting up better infrastructure that will be more resilient, or coming up with programs which will eventually try to save jobs and livelihood which might have been lost from the disasters. So I think in the sense that does government get it, I think we do get it. And that's already quite advanced compared to a lot of other countries who still don't want to admit that there is climate change in the world. So I think in terms of admitting that there is, and obviously because we are where we are in the world physically, we do see it regularly, admitting that there is this problem, that it is the new normal, trying to create the necessary systems and budgets to be put in place to solve these issues. I think government is there. What I think still needs to be done is really on the implementation and the execution, which of course is where everything at the end will boil
Yeah.
down to. So I think in the planning side it's there, but we need the help of the people. We need the help of the citizens to also be to also do their share. No, if there are areas which are now red zones, for example, or no build zones, we need the people's cooperation to actually make sure that these areas are kept safe. If there are consultations with the youth or with other stakeholders in terms of trying to come up with better communities which are more disaster resilient, we need you to show up, no? Because everyone needs to do their part, no? And definitely, I think this government, and I'm sure next governments, no, whoever it is in the political spectrum, because we are Filipinos and because we do live in this part of the world, I think it is already part of our lives, and preparing for it, planning for it, and trying to create the systems to get back up after we're hit from disasters is already part of the Filipino life now.
We'd like to move on to another representative of the government. National Youth Commission, Kit Cruz, from the National Youth Commission, Kit Cruz. We'd like to ask you, he's the chair of the Committee on Participation, and we'd like to ask you, what is the critical climate change issue that the NYC considers the most pressing, or the one that has the most impact on the youth, and what are your projects to address these?
It's funny how we're being referred to as being in government. I mean, typically when you think of government, you think of old people. So it's nice that it's actually young people taking the charge now. And I guess related to that, one of the more pressing issues when it comes to climate change is the integration of disaster risk reduction management. I think it's very important that we put DRRM as the forefront of climate change. Up to now, I think there's still a difference when you think of climate change as one thing and DRRM as another. It's high time that we actually integrate both. And where young people come in specifically now is participation. So yes, it's no coincidence that I'm part of the Committee on Participation, and I'm talking about participation now. We've seen from last year's tragedies in Yolanda and in Bohol that young people, if given an opportunity, can really contribute not just to disaster mitigation, but also to disaster risk reduction. So I think it's very important that young people are given a chance to participate directly in the mechanisms of government where they can make an impact. Right now, one of the priorities of the National Youth Commission is integrating youth participation in the disaster councils, both in the national as well as in the local level. So we're actually working now towards having youth representation, again, in the top level as well as in the bottom level. So we're looking at a top-bottom approach here so that young people aren't just tapped for disaster management. When the tragedies come, young people are being tapped for packing rice or going down to the areas, but to have a more proactive role so as to prevent and to mitigate disasters.
How would we become part of that?
Well, right now we're actually talking to the OCD, to the Office of Civil Defense, as well as the National Disaster Risk Reduction Councils for us to become an observer in the proceedings. So the National Youth Commission also recently came up with a resolution requesting the NDRRMC to become a permanent observer of the said council. Of course, in the future, we're looking towards a more permanent and active role in the actual council, but for now, baby steps. So we want to be an observer first, but it doesn't mean that we'll just be relegated to the sidelines, watching the proceedings as it goes along. But we're trying to be a bit more realistic in our approach. We want to be an observer first, but of course, by already sitting in the council, it gives us an opportunity to spread down to the grassroots, the going-ons in the top level, and at the same time, the youth or youth representation can also be a part of the local level, specifically in the regional, all the way down to the barangay levels. So observer first, but of course, by by having a foot in the door, will be able to sow down to the grassroots, so to speak, what the going ons in the top.
Thank you. Thank you, Sir Kit. I'd like to open up the floor for questions from the audience. Are there any burning issues you have that you would like to raise in terms of disaster risk reduction, climate change, food security? Anybody? They're very shy today. Should I start calling out names?
This is not what I heard about the youth in the Philippines. I heard that you were very, very direct. And let me ask you a question. So how do you communicate with the people who are still denying the impact of climate change? We put out several reports. What would a 4-degree Celsius warmer world look like? What would even a 3 or a 2-degree Celsius warmer world would look like? And right now we're at about 0.8, but it looks like there's just there's already too much carbon in the air to prevent us from getting probably at least to 2 degrees Celsius. Yeah. And the thing is, a 2-degree Celsius world is going to be completely different from the world you know today. It's going to be completely different. And they say that carbon is the currency of climate change, but water is the teeth of climate change. China is already facing a situation where they have 9% of the water of the drinkable water in the world and 21+% of the population. Wars over water and food are going to become the norm, and this is not when you're in your 90s. This is in the relatively near future. So I just want to know what can you guys do, because it's really your world that we're talking about. For people who think, well, maybe my grandchildren will be affected, we're talking about potentially getting close to 2 degrees Celsius in 2030, right? You will all still be young by that time. I will be much older, but I will still be here, right? And so I worry about this every day. I worry about this every day, especially because I have young children. I have a 5-year-old and a 14-year-old. And I tell you, I think that, based on the way my kids already talk to me, they're going to say things to me like, Dad, what the hell were you thinking? You were president of the World Bank. You were putting billions of dollars into energy, billions of dollars into infrastructure. Why didn't you do more? That's the thought that is in my head every single day. But there are still people who are deniers. There are still people who don't want to face this. What are you guys doing?
Anybody? Oh, there.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for coming to the Philippines. I'm Jay Abonetra from the Yellow Boat of Hope Foundation. Coming off from what you shared, I'm a personal friend of Marshall Goldsmith, who I believe is your coach.
He's my coach, yes.
Yeah, and it pertains to youth leadership in this sector particularly. Is the World Bank doing something in terms of, because there's really a lot that needs to be done. Is the World Bank looking at, capacity building in the sector in terms of mentoring or coaching young leaders?
Absolutely. Check out Connect for Climate. It's our big program where we're trying to build youth leadership. And we had everybody in the Connect for Climate group at the World Bank for, I think it was the annual meetings. But we're trying to do this. We're doing everything we can to try to build youth leadership around this issue. Next spring, we're trying to bring together all the movements that are focusing on fighting poverty with the environmental movement on Earth Day. We're trying to put something together where we make that connection. Because the thing is, if you don't care about climate change, but you say you care about poverty, right? Those two things, you can't do that. You cannot care about one and not about the other. Because what we know, and it happened in Tacloban, and it happens at every level, that even in a place that's relatively poor, it's the poorest in that relatively overall poor place that are affected the most. I was just in Tacloban City, and there are signs that say this is a no-building zone. But people don't have a choice, so they're building there, right? And it's not because they want to put themselves in dangerous way. This is the place that's easiest for them to actually build some kind of a shelter. So what we know is that as the impact of climate change grows, it's going to disproportionately affect poor people. Poor people are going to be the least able to adapt. Poor people are going to be the last to get access to clean, potable water. And this has got to be something that we take together. No, you can't say that you're ending poverty and at the same time say that climate change is not an issue. So again, we're working on developing leadership, but we need the youth to stand up and simply insist that the rest of us pay attention.
Any other questions or comments to the question posed earlier? Answers? I think, Dr. Kim, in the Philippines, climate change, denying that climate change exists isn't one of our biggest problems because we feel it. It's really, I think one of the challenges is communicating it, even in terms of language. Like after Yolanda happened, one of the biggest discussions was there's no Filipino term for storm surge. So in the news, when they were saying, a storm surge is gonna come, no one understood what it meant. I remember when I was doing community work in Tacloban, they said, we thought that the storm surge would just be like waves crashing into we didn't know it would be this tall or go in this deep into our place. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And we're very lucky to have somebody from the media here. And we'd like to ask her, Ms. Leah Cruz from Interaction. Communication is very important in issues like this. So how is the media communicating climate change to the masses? Like, do you know of any innovative mechanisms maybe in the Philippines or other parts of the world that we can?
Hi, my name is Leah. I'm a weather presenter for TV5, and I also do other work for the station. And with regards to your question, you already mentioned that one of the biggest problems when Haiyan or Yolanda hit was that the people who were in Tacloban and in the areas that were the worst hit, they had no idea what a storm surge was. And it was said over and over in the news. I said it myself, and they didn't know. They were saying, why didn't you just say tidal wave? And on the scientific portion of that, it's not exactly the same. So you can't say that because it's wrong actually to warn people about a tidal wave, which comes from an earthquake or a volcanic eruption. It comes from deep in the ground, whereas a storm surge is caused because of the wind pushing the water. And that's what causes the flooding. And that's one of the challenges that we face in the media communicating these things. But I think, TV5 is placing a premium on, and this is not an ad for TV5 or Interaction, hello. But we do place a premium on weather because we do think that it's going to be one of the biggest issues that the world will face in the coming years. So we do have hourly weather updates. Interaction has a lot of weather updates, and you can actually check them out. And again, it's not an ad. And but I do think that it's a pressing concern, especially here in the Philippines. For the past few months, actually, I've sort of been living and breathing climate change. I attended a climate change conference in Paris back in April, and I was the only Filipino there. It was the first time that they thought of inviting anyone from the Philippines because of the recent Haiyan. And sa totoo lang, bida ako dyan. Everyone was asking about the Philippines and about the effects of Haiyan, and I was able to learn from a lot of the other meteorologists, which I'm not, and a lot of the other weather presenters there, about how they communicate important issues regarding the weather, regarding climate change. Because here in the Philippines, we're practically the worst hit in the entire world. We are the third most disaster-prone nation in the entire world. And we all have also experienced the highest sea level rise in the entire world. So the average since 1901 has been 19 centimeters. But here in the Philippines, when they recorded it, it was at 60 centimeters. So you can just see how far the disparity is. And what does that mean? A higher sea level will mean, obviously, when the typhoons come in, and because of climate change, because our seas, our oceans are getting warmer, that means stronger typhoons, stronger tropical cyclones. When these hit us, the flooding will be worse, the storm surges will be worse. There will be very little land that will break those storm surges. And we're a coastal country. We have coastal communities, 36,000 kilometers, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not so sure about the numbers. That's our coastline. And most of our people who live there in these communities are very much threatened. And it's a question of life or death. So one of the biggest issues in media, in weather, and communicating is how do you even get out these signals that you could actually perish when this storm surge comes in. Right now, we're waiting for Glenda. Everyone is probably looking out the window and trying to check if it's raining because it's scheduled to make landfall later. And we are expecting storm surges. And it will be here in Metro Manila tomorrow morning. And you see how these terms, such as storm surge, have become so. Well, now everyone knows what it is, but it's a challenge to communicate these things, even to, especially to a community level. And I'm actually glad that there are a lot of youth leaders here because a lot of you do deal with people in the communities. And maybe it's also time to start looking at it as your responsibility to educate the people in the communities, the farmers, the fishermen, with these terms because not everyone has had the same education level as you had. So it's very useful to understand this because it's no longer a question of sounding smart or understanding the weather report on TV. It's actually a question of life or death. Before it started, we were actually discussing about stuff that I'd learned from other weather presenters in other countries back in the conference. And I was very impressed with a weather presenter from Africa who said that they actually distributed cell phones in the very remote areas because there their problem is drought. And they have a text brigade. This is a weather presenter, and they send the weather report because they don't have television sets. Sometimes they don't have radio, although radio is a much more available form of media and communication. But when it's a question of life or death, these issues of communication come up, and I do think it's time we start working on these here in the Philippines because we do have everything online and we have television and radio, but it's not always accessible in these remote areas where the people who are hardest hit are living. And I think they're telling me to get off the stage, so you guys can go back.
Okay, we'd like to open again the floor for questions from the audience.
Two back
Okay.
here. Yeah.
So we'll take her question and then please introduce yourself and what organization
Hello?
you're from.
Is this on?
Yes.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Divine. I'm a broadcast communication student from UP Diliman. And regarding Ms. Leah's comment, I actually know that there is an effort from the Department of Broadcast Communication to go to different regions in the country and study the dialects of people so that we can translate terms for disasters. So we can go down to the provinces and translate that a storm surge is how it's going to be and their terms for it. So I guess there should be a very good partnership between the academe and mass media on that end. And second, because I'm young and it's my job to criticize, um, three situations. One, the country's veteran meteorologists are leaving the country for higher wages overseas, and the workers of Pag-asa have long been denied proper compensation. Second, Filipinos are inventing green technology, but the process of patenting it is very arduous and there is no proper support for it. And the third is that energy is very much an issue of climate change, and several countries are opting for alternative greener sources. But the president is oft quoted for saying, "What if there's no wind?" or "What if there's no sun?" So I know that the government has an effort, but on these things, is the government working on these things and prioritizing these things? And it's that effort firm and consistent.
You're asking me about the Philippines government.
It's actually more of Senator Aquino. And if the World, sorry, and actually on your end, if the World Bank is feeling and seeing that effort.
Well, let me give Senator Aquino a minute to collect his thoughts.
No, I was going to pull up a chair in the front, actually.
I saw her making eye contact with you while
okay.
she was asking the question. So
let me, this is a deep issue that touches many very sensitive areas, and yet we have no choice but to try to move forward and solve it. So on the one hand, we are very, we know that right now, for example, if you look at all the oil and mining companies, the oil companies, their market capitalization, the value on the market is based to a certain extent on the reserves that they have already found. But we cannot burn those reserves if we are to have any hope of keeping global warming at 2 degrees Celsius or below. So in other words, they are capitalized with the assumption that they're going to burn oil that we know if they do, we're going to be up in the 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius, which would be a complete disaster. Right? So that's part of the reality. Another part of the reality is that poor countries are saying, why are you punishing us for carbon that we did not put up in the air? Right? And the Africans are especially vocal, and we have to listen to them. Now, there are people who, in the environmental world, and it's interesting because now there's kind of a split. There's a group that's very focused on conservation. And then there's another group that's saying, well, the biggest crisis is climate change. And they're actually different positions. Because a group that's just focused on conservation, for example, is very much against hydroelectric power. Whereas the group that's really focused on climate change says, well, my goodness, what other options do we have, right? So this is very complicated stuff right now. Here's what we believe. First of all, we think that developing countries have a right to power. And they have a right to continuous power. So when President Aquino says, what about if there's no sun or no wind? He's exactly right. Because there's not a country in the world that has developed on the basis of intermittent power. And with just solar and wind, you are not going to get a consistent base load of power. So we've got to find a way to do that. Now, in my view, it means we have to aggressively go after geothermal. I mean, the whole area in Leyte, the electricity, I understand, is based on geothermal. So we've got to go after geothermal. We've got to get serious about hydroelectric power. We know that there is a bad history of hydroelectric power projects gone awry. But the thing is, we have no choice. If we go into Africa and we say to the Africans, you can't have coal, you can't have nuclear, and you can't have hydroelectric power, we're not serious. We're not serious about their right to power and their right to have their industries and their businesses grow to create jobs. And it's the same thing here in the Philippines. The Philippines needs power. So we've got to use every single clean source that we can. And we're just not there yet with solar and hydro. We don't have the capacity to do concentrated solar and store the energy so that we can provide a continuous baseload. It's just not possible yet. So the way we feel about it is, there are many, many different justice issues involved. There's the social justice issue related to poor people who didn't put the carbon in the air having a right to power. But then there's the climate justice issue, which is quite different, for example, than what the conservationists say, who really want to focus on not disturbing the environment so that they can enjoy nature, right? And we're in the middle of trying to negotiate all those things. My own view is what we'll end up with is a much deeper commitment to hydroelectric power, every effort we can make to tap geothermal power, but then also a very wise use of solar and wind so that over time, as the technology gets better, we may be able to use it as baseload. But these are just scientific realities that we have to face. And there's no easy answer. I mean, there's just so much disagreement, even right now, in the environmental community. We've got to go forward, though.
Thank you for that, Dr.
Okay, Senator.
I guess he answered everything already, but maybe just to add, it's really hard, It's really difficult. If we could survive purely on the alternative, it's not even alternative anymore, and the renewable energy sources, then we should. But currently, as Dr. Kim said, the science isn't there yet. But it will get there, and I really believe that maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, you will see more efficient solar batteries, you'll see more efficient, clean type of energy, and we should be able to shift and move there when these technologies are ready. Now, I won't repeat what Dr. Kim said, but let me just add that on our front, as Committee on Trade chairperson, I'm looking at the issue partly as an ease of doing business issue. What do I mean? We have a lot of renewable energy companies who want to come into the Philippines, but are having a hard time getting the right permits. To put up a micro solar plant or a micro hydro plant takes you about 300 signatures. I mean, that inefficiency, you can, for me, I equate inefficiency with corruption.
Yes.
If you're making it extremely difficult for someone to do something, it's as if, you're already infringing upon their right to be able to transact. So I look at it from that point of view. If these smaller players, and we're talking about 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt types of installations in a few rivers or a few biomass type installations, for example, for farms so they can be self-sustaining, if it takes you so much to be able to put something up or even to go to market, then that's a type of corruption already. So in the last hearing we had on energy, it was the topic was something else. It was actually about the Meralco issue, but I raised the issue with the secretary regarding the number of signatures needed, and that if we could actually fast track our processes to be able to get these companies up and running as soon as possible. And most of these are actually smaller companies which do transact in renewable energy. Then hopefully we'll be able to help in that mix and create a better mix for our country, no? Because you can't have just one source, no?
Right.
The reality now is that you have all these different sources, and you're trying to be able to get a mix which actually is best for the people, which is price, and of course the best for the environment, which is as much as possible, as renewable as possible. Now, just to finally add to what Dr. Kim had mentioned also, we're actually doing well in terms of geothermal. We're the second largest geothermal producer in the world, next to the US. It's already the Philippines. So this is one aspect I think that we don't really talk about enough. Our Mindanao is largely run by the hydro, by the waterfalls, and there are some issues on that. But hopefully, if we can repair or improve the facilities, you can actually get more energy from the hydro plants there. There are a few solar farms being put up in North Luzon and other areas. Hopefully, they'll be able to also make a dent in terms of our energy mix. But it's just that I think when you look at the problem of energy, it's really a complex issue. No, there's just no one single answer. But the best thing is to have your principles set, which is the more renewable, the better. The cheaper, of course, the better. And if you're just able to move alongside the developments in science, I think we'll be able to catch that curve and hopefully not go the route of other countries where their use of energy has just spiraled out of control. No?
Yeah.
We're actually a country where we don't really use a lot of energy. We're really good citizens of the world in that sense. No? So in the sense of providing or damaging the environment, we're actually quite far from other countries which are our size. But again, you're right. No? I think moving to the future, we do have to be cognizant of that. And we just have to make sure that each step of the way, our principles are clear that we have to do what's best for the people and for the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Aquino. And now we have to wrap up the conversation. So we'd like to ask for a closing message from Dr. Kim. But I'd also like to ask if there's one thing that all the participants here can do, just one thing when they get out of this room, what would it be? What would you ask them to commit? And then your general message.
Let me think about that as I give the final message. One of the things that I've said to now several audiences here is that when I was younger, 30 years ago, I came here to the Philippines for the first time, and unfortunately, that's the last time I've been to the Philippines. And so over that 30 years, I was at that time studying the Korean development story. I was a graduate student in anthropology, and I was trying to understand where Korea was in its development path. And by the 1980s, Korea was developing rapidly. It was moving very quickly. And then 1988 was the Summer Olympics when it really sort of, that was its coming out party to the world. But when I was born in 1959 in Korea, in the 60s and 70s, development economists overwhelmingly thought that Korea would have zero chance of becoming a developed country, South Korea. And they said instead that the country with the most promise is the Philippines. And so the question that I keep asking is, why was that promise that the development economists saw in the 60s and 70s, why has that not been fully realized? Now, I really believe that President Aquino was on the right path. He said, let me see if I get it right, kung walang kurap, walang mahirap. Right? That is absolutely true. I think that the problem of corruption, and let me just say this, it has nothing to do with the culture of the Philippines or anything like that. Because I've seen cultures where there was a lot of corruption, where strong governments really rooted it out. Right? So I really believe that as in my trip here, what I really have seen is that that potential that the development economists saw in the 60s and 70s is not only here, but it's multiplied many times. Looking at you guys, the Filipino youth are famous for the ability in multiple language, especially English, a very hard work ethic. 31% of the population in the Philippines is young people. So you have the chance to drive the next economic miracle. Now, that has to be done, in accordance with very important principles like combating climate change. Because you guys, there are some countries that can ignore climate change because it's not going to be right on their shores. You guys cannot, right? So you are the generation that has to take in the fact that there's 36,000 kilometers of shoreline, frankly, almost all of which is in danger of having storm surges. I mean, this is what we've just heard, that almost all of it is in danger of having these very deadly storm surges. You guys live in that kind of a country. So the task for you, in my view, is fuel the next great Asian economic miracle. You have all the pieces here in the Philippines to do it. And really, you have to demand it. This is going to be your world. You have to demand it. You have to push yourselves. You have to get out there, gain the expertise in all the most important areas, and you guys have to push it. But there is no question that the Philippines can be the source of the next great success story. That's one. The second thing is I think that it's very important for you guys to embrace this notion, kung walang kurap, walang mahirap. Because you have to be the ones who demand that the way of doing business changes. Because, the old systems where who you knew is more important than what you know, and, being part of this or that or the other clan is the way to get ahead, you're the ones who have to insist that that stops. So you have a very courageous government right now that's trying to take on vested interest and really tackle this issue. They need your support. And also, if at any time, if you see corruption anywhere, you have to be ready to stand up and fight it. So that's the second thing, and I really mean it. The Filipino youth, I've had very close Filipino friends all my life, right? And there's a very special talent for expression, for artistry. Whatever it is, you have to support that movement to end corruption, create that level playing field for everybody. That's the second point. And the third thing that I'd leave with you is that I think it's really important for your generation to truly embrace the notion of being global citizens. Right now, there's a lot of tension in Asia. And a lot of that tension goes back to decades old rivalries and decades old, grudges that people have against each other, right? You guys have to be ones, especially in Asia, where you embrace the rest of Asia and really see at least all of Asia, but also much, much further, Africa. You guys have to be the global citizens. You have literally the world at your fingertips in your smartphones. When I was in Bolivia, the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, took me to 14,000 feet, way up in the mountains, to play soccer with him, of all things, football maybe, as you recall. And as we were landing in the most remote village in Bolivia, people were taking pictures of us with their smartphones. When I went to Uttar Pradesh, the poorest state in India, the people there were watching Korean soap operas on their smartphones, right? How many of you watch Korean soap operas? Right? So, it's a different world. Everybody knows how everyone else lives, and everybody wants a better life. They want to join the global middle class. It's really important for you guys to embrace the rest of the world, especially Asia, but don't fall prey to these old wounds, these old prejudices, these old grudges that people have, and just insist that the world's going to be different from here on. That the world is going to be a place where if you work hard, there's going to be a level playing field and you can get ahead. So I'm sorry, it's not one thing. I said three things. But I have to tell you, I'm walking away from the Philippines just full of hope and optimism for this country. Right? You take stock of all the things that you guys have. This is one of the most global international countries in the world. The lingua franca these days, unfortunately, or not, depending on your perspective, is English. When Japanese and Korean businessmen do business together, they speak in English. You guys have that skill, without question, more than any other country in East Asia. Make use of it, be global citizens, tackle the problems, insist on the fight against corruption. And I am sure that when you get to be an old man like me, you will be really proud of being the generation that drove the next great Asian miracle. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Zhou. So thank you to everybody here today and to those following the discussion online. Remember, the youth of today are supposed to fuel the next economic miracle, the next Asian economic miracle, and write the next great success story. But no pressure. Thank you again.
Can I say
yes.
my last? So
Yes.
I've been really practicing my Tagalog. So I just want to end by saying, mula sa isang kapatid, maraming salamat.